Hey friends, welcome back to Homestead on a Prayer. In case you're new here, my name's Jennifer, and today we are going to make together my family's favorite traditional Christmas breakfast. It's a little bit decadent, so in my family we only have this once a year, and that is sourdough cinnamon rolls. They're so delicious, and my family really looks forward to them every year. So I will say ahead of time that this is a 2-day process. So if you plan to serve this for Christmas morning, you're going to want to start making your dough on Christmas Eve. I usually start sometime in the morning on Christmas Eve, then they go in the fridge overnight. In the morning you can pull them out and bake them, and then your family will have a delicious breakfast on Christmas morning. Now, I know I said that my family only gets this breakfast once a year. This year, because I wanted to make sure to get this video ready for you guys to post a couple days before Christmas, of course I'm making them a little bit early this year, which means that my family is going to get a bonus cinnamon roll breakfast tomorrow morning. So let's get started. The first thing you're going to need is your sourdough starter. You want this starter to be fed because this is not a discard recipe. When you're making a sourdough discard recipe, your recipe is going to be relying on something other than the sourdough starter to get its rising power, such as yeast, baking powder, something like that. This recipe is not a discard recipe, which means you need to have a fed active starter. So I keep my starter on the counter and I feed it once a day. A lot of people will choose to keep their starter in the refrigerator and feed it once a week. Honestly, it's just personal preference. It's going to depend on your schedule. It's going to depend on how often you bake with your sourdough starter. I find for me, as I said, out of sight tends to be out of mind. So if I put it in my refrigerator, it doesn't get fed. We also bake with it really often, so I like to keep it on my counter. Before we get started working with our starter though, the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to heat up 1 cup of milk, because we want this milk to have time to heat up and also cool down before we add it to our starter. We want to scald our milk, which means that I want to heat it up until it's steaming but not boiling, and then let it cool down. So I just have it in a little pan here. I'm going to heat it up over medium-high heat. I'm going to keep a close eye on it to make sure that it doesn't start to boil. So I will say I'm going to cheat a little bit with this recipe here. The recipe calls for the cup of milk to be scalded and then cooled, and it also calls for 2 ounces or 1/4 cup of warm water. What I'm going to do instead, I'm going to take my 1/4 cup of cold water, I'm going to add it right into the milk and let the milk warm it up, and that will help speed up the cooling process of my milk. So honestly, just because I don't feel like waiting as long for it to cool, that will allow us to get to the next step of our dough a little bit faster. So now that our milk and water have cooled down to lukewarm, we're going to measure up 1 cup of our active sourdough starter. Going to add our starter right into the bowl of our stand mixer here. Now into our sourdough starter, we're just going to add our cooled milk and water mixture and 2 cups of all-purpose flour. We're just going to mix this up in our mixer on low until it's combined. Now that this is all combined, I'm just going to cover it with a clean kitchen towel. We're just going to let it sit for 30 minutes. So the beginnings of our cinnamon roll dough have been sitting for about 30 minutes, and now it's time to add the rest of our ingredients. I have here 1/2 stick of butter that I melted and let cool. I'm going to add that in. I'm going to add 1 egg. I always like to crack it into a separate container, just in case you get a bad egg or in case any shells get in. It's easier to fish them out. We're going to add 1/3 of a cup of granulated sugar. And a teaspoon of salt. We're just going to mix all these ingredients up. Now that this is all mixed up, we're going to go ahead and remove this paddle attachment, and we're going to switch to our dough hook. Now that we have our mixer fitted with a dough hook, we're going to add 2 more cups of all-purpose flour, about 1/2 cup at a time. Just get that incorporated and then add the next 1/2 cup. We're going to add our final about half cup of flour in here, and then we're going to knead this a little longer. Now what we're looking for as we knead, just get the rest of that flour in there. What we're looking for as we knead is for all of this dough to clear the sides of the bowl, just wrap around the dough hook. We don't see how right now it's it's not really clinging in a cohesive ball. We want to change that. That's how we'll know when we've added enough flour. We don't want the dough to be stiff. We want it to be fairly moist and sticky, but we do want it to kind of gather around the dough hook in a ball. So as I've added the rest of the flour, we're going to go ahead and knead it for about 5 minutes, and I'm going to watch for that to happen. So you can see how our dough has kind of changed texture. It's gathering into a cohesive ball now. This is what we want. Now what we want to do is set this dough aside to ferment for about 3 hours. So we want to put it in an oiled bowl. Rather than getting a second bowl dirty, I'm just going to pull the dough out, oil this bowl, and then let it ferment right in here. And this is a good opportunity to really get a feel for your dough and see if it is the texture that you want. We want it to be nice and smooth, as you can see that it is. We want it's a little bit sticky, which is okay. We want to kind of shape it into a fairly smooth ball. It doesn't really need to be perfect at this point. Just going to spray this bowl. We're going to stick it back into the bowl, smooth side down. Just turn it to coat and flip it back over. So I've got our dough in our oiled bowl. We're just going to go ahead and cover this. I'm going to let this ferment at room temperature for about 3 hours. During that 3-hour fermentation time, I'm going to try to do about 3 or 4 sets of stretches and folds on this dough, just to help it really develop some structure as it ferments. I'm going to meet you back here in about half an hour to do the first stretch and fold, and I'll show you how that goes then. Our cinnamon roll dough has been fermenting for about 30 minutes, so I'm going to show you how we do our stretches and folds. Now with this kind of recipe, since we did actually knead the dough pretty thoroughly, I do a much more simple stretch and fold than I would if I was making traditional sourdough bread where it isn't kneaded at all. So we're just going to do a pretty basic stretch and fold. So what I like to do is just grab one end of the dough and fold it over. And then you go around the dough, and I'm actually going to lift it out to get the last couple. So I'm just going to stretch it out and fold it back in on itself. I just go around and basically shape it back into a smooth ball. Then we're going to go ahead and put it back in the bowl upside down. So I'm going to do that same thing about 2 or 3 times over the next 2.5 hours. I'm just going to continue doing the same thing about every 30 to 60 minutes. Once our 3-hour fermentation period is done, I'll meet you back here and we can shape our cinnamon rolls. So our cinnamon roll dough has been fermenting for actually a little bit more than 3 hours, probably about 4, maybe even close to 5 hours. It's pretty forgiving that way, so it's fine that we let it go a little bit longer. So in this mug here, I have half a stick of butter that I melted. We're going to brush about half of it on this pan here, just to grease it for our cinnamon rolls. We want to butter this pretty generously because our cinnamon rolls are going to get pretty sticky and we don't want them sticking to the pan. So we're going to reserve the other half of the butter to brush the tops of our cinnamon rolls after we finish shaping them. Next we're going to mix together our filling ingredients. So I'm going to need half a cup each of granulated sugar and brown sugar. Our sugars, we're going to add a tablespoon of ground cinnamon and then mix it all together. We're going to roll our cinnamon roll dough out right on this counter here, so I'm just going to lightly flour this surface. So you can see our dough has risen quite a bit. It's gotten nice and smooth and silky. As you do the stretches and folds, you can feel the change in the dough. It's going to get smoother and silkier as you go and nice and rich feeling. Now we want to roll this out and keep it as rectangular as possible to about 18 by 16 inches. You don't need to be all that precise. The recipe does say to spread it out without kneading out all of the air. I honestly don't really think that that's very possible. and it's going to rise overnight in the refrigerator and regain a lot of that puffiness. So I wouldn't really worry too much about kneading the air out of it. It's hard to keep this in a perfect rectangle, but we're just going to do the best we can because that's going to make it a little bit easier to roll out or to roll up our actual rolls. I think this is about the right size. I'm just going to try to square up the corners a little bit, as much as I can. Just going to crack an egg in here to use as an egg wash. Now we're going to brush the entire surface of the cinnamon roll dough with this egg wash here. The recipe says be very generous to use about half of the egg wash or so. I didn't add anything to this egg. I just cracked an egg in here and beat it up, and that's our egg wash. This is what's going to allow our cinnamon and sugar to stick, so we definitely want to make sure we have enough egg so that lots of cinnamon and sugar can stick and make a delicious filling for cinnamon rolls. Next, we're going to take our cinnamon sugar mixture and sprinkle it evenly along the dough and just smooth it out to make sure that every bite is equally delicious. Now I'm going to really carefully and tightly roll up the edges of this dough. You want to keep it as tight as you can to avoid any air pockets. I have a bench scraper here. Sometimes I find that if the dough sticks to the counter a little bit, a bench scraper is good at keeping everything even, although it doesn't seem like I'm really going to need it today. Sometimes if I get to the end and it's not quite even, I'll stretch it out a little bit to make sure that it reaches all the way to the edge of the dough. Then I like to pinch all along the seam here, just to try to seal it shut as much as I can. Then what I want to do is cut this into 12 equal pieces. So I usually cut it in half first. I've got a sharp steak knife here. Cut it into quarters. Then I'll just take each quarter and cut that into thirds. I find that that's the best way to make these be as even as possible. And we're just going to arrange these in our buttered baking dish here. These will expand quite a bit as they rise and fill out all the rest of the space. I'm going to take the rest of the melted butter here and brush the tops of the cinnamon rolls. So these rolls are ready to sit in the refrigerator overnight. I'm just going to cover them with some plastic wrap, and then when I want to bake them tomorrow, I'll take them out of the fridge. I'll let them come up to room temperature and then rise at room temperature for about an hour and a half to 2 hours. Once they've risen for 1.5 to 2 hours and gotten nice and puffy, I'm going to pop them in a 375-degree oven for about 25 to 30 minutes until the center is all set. Then we're going to make a quick, easy glaze, and then we're going to enjoy them. It's the next day. Our cinnamon rolls were rising in the fridge all night. I just popped them in the oven. While they're cooking, we are going to make a really simple icing to top our cinnamon rolls with. Now, the recipe, which I am going to link in the video description, by the way, so that you can make this recipe yourself if you'd like to. The recipe that I use does include a recipe for cream cheese icing, which I'm sure is really delicious, but we're just going to make a really simple glaze for ours. And today I'm just going to make it vanilla, but honestly, a lot of times what we do is I'll make half the glaze recipe vanilla and the other half orange, which is really delicious too. If you do want to make it orange, you can just replace the vanilla extract that I'm going to add with orange extract, and that's really delicious. Or you could fresh squeeze some orange juice and replace some of the cream that I'm going to use with orange juice. So those are some really great options. We're just going to make really simple vanilla today, so let's get started. So we are going to start with a cup of powdered sugar. So that's slightly less than a cup. And we're going to use 2 to 3 tablespoons of heavy cream. I'm going to go with 3, or we'll go slightly less than 3. Finally, I'm going to add about half a teaspoon of good vanilla. And I'm going to add just the tiniest pinch of salt, just to balance out the flavor. I find it keeps the icing from being too sweet and just adds a little bit of depth of flavor. You definitely don't want to add very much because we don't want it to be salty. Let's just mix this up and we'll see if we need to adjust anything. So I switched to a fork for my icing because my powdered sugar was just a little bit lumpy. So there we go. Really nice, delicious, simple icing. Now when the cinnamon rolls come out, we are going to want to eat them warm. I wanted to make sure to have this icing ready. Now a lot of baked goods, of course, you're supposed to wait for them to cool before eating them, but cinnamon rolls really are just so much better enjoyed warm. So as soon as they come out of the oven, we're going to ice them and enjoy a couple of them. So here are our cinnamon rolls, all delicious and cooked. They smell amazing. I'm going to let them cool for just a couple minutes, and then we're going to glaze them, and then we'll let them cool enough that we don't burn our mouths when we eat them, but I cannot wait to try them. Now you probably noticed when we first took them out of the refrigerator this morning that some of the sugar that we had filled them with had kind of dissolved into a syrup and made a layer on the bottom. That bakes up into such a delicious sticky crust on the bottom of these cinnamon rolls. It's so good. So as you can see, you probably can't see as well now because they filled out nicely, but you can see in the little bits between them, you can see that's turned into a delicious, nice thick crust, and I'll show you once we cut into them what that looks like up close. So our cinnamon rolls are done and iced, and they look delicious. I cannot wait to try these. So look at that gooey, delicious bottom of the cinnamon roll. I'm going to put it on a plate before it makes a mess all over my kitchen. This looks so good. We're going to give it a try. This is so good. These cinnamon rolls are a hit in my family, and they're popular for a reason, so definitely make these. Cinnamon rolls can be something that seems intimidating, but honestly, once you do it, it's actually not that hard. So I definitely encourage you to give this a try. This makes a great decadent Christmas breakfast, or for any other special occasion, or, you know, sometimes you just want something really sweet just because. So I hope that you're having a great day, and I can't wait to see you soon. I'll see you next time.